It really does mean a lot to be introduced by someone that you've looked up to for a good portion of your life. And as I call her Aunt Deb mentioned, we've known each other for a long, long time. And it just goes to show also that when people can see positive examples of themselves, they have the potential to really achieve so many things with their lives. And so as we're talking about diversity here today, I think one of the biggest pieces of this as well is that people have the opportunity to see each and every one of you. And it's not just young people per se, but it's also professionals like who are in the room today to know that it's possible to achieve varied levels of success. So I want to say a few thanks, and then I will get into my presentation, and you all already have the food, so I am standing in the way of nothing. I want to thank Nika for the opportunity to be here today, and I want to thank Ben from the Greenville Chamber of Commerce for the excellent work that they are doing to advance the agenda of diversity in Greenville. So if we could please give them both a round of applause here today. What I'm going to talk about is how to form relationships by leveraging diversity, how companies need to leverage diversity, understand diversity, but I'm going to start by having a conversation about what diversity truly is. Because we can talk about diversity all day, but when we talk about it, it may be in the context and the confines of what we're exposed to at this very moment. But there's a lot that's happening in this country, and I think it's really important for us as business leaders to understand what those changing dynamics are. So, a few housekeeping items. We've already talked about this. I will go through that very quickly. And if you would like to tweet any of this, I am a millennial, and we do use social media. You can follow me on Twitter. So, the new definition of diversity. Old definitions of diversity were essentially black and white, but that's not the way that diversity is defined today. Diversity is defined by a number of different variables, including age, gender, race, ethnicity, which in many instances are perceived to be different and are different, experience, religion, and sexuality. And when we talk about diversity in the context of racial or ethnic diversity, all of those additional variables still play. So we can have a young African-American millennial and a baby boomer Hispanic, and it's still, there's lots of layers of what diversity is and what diversity means. Go to the next slide. So who are the multiculturals? A lot of times people don't realize that 40% of millennials today, 40% are people of African American, Hispanic, or Asian descent, which is having considerable changes to the way that we do business and the way that we engage those communities. Statistics have shown that by 2050, the majority of the country will be people of color. And so what does that mean for how businesses, how professionals, how individuals engage with each other, and how they expand and grow their companies? I want to point out a few important details. The Hispanic population is going to double from 15% to 30% by 2050. The African American population is projected to increase from 41.1 million to 65.7 million by 2050. And the Asian American population is expected to increase from 5.1% to 9.2% of the population. What does that look like when mapped out over wealth? Because again, we can't have a conversation about diversity until we really understand what diversity is and what diversity means. For African American and Hispanic communities, that's $3 trillion in spending power in 2015. $3 trillion. And I stress that again because we're business leaders. And And it's important that we understand the viability of diverse communities as markets, because it also reflects itself in our hiring practices, which I'll get to shortly. In terms of economic impact, if African Americans were a country that would rank 16 in the world, number 16, in terms of economic spend. And this is from the Nielsen report. And the per capita income of U.S. Hispanics is higher than any one of the highly coveted BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So again, I think it's very important that we have that as the backdrop and the context for what we're talking about when we talk about diversity. Because it's no longer so much so a conversation about a segmented group. Really and truly, diversity is diversity. It is the future pipeline for business. It is the future pipeline for talent. So what the smart guys or gals say: workplace diversity is among the most important predictors of a business's sales, revenue, customer numbers, and profitability. So bottom line here is, to grow and advance your business, diversity should really be an integrated part of the fabric of what you do as a company. When we look at diversity in sales, when you add race to the dynamic of your company, it has the potential, and this is based off a 2009 report by the American Sociology Review, to increase sales by 15 times. So you get 15 times more sales when you add race as a variable to the diversity quotient within your company. When you reduce gender within the diversity quotient of your company, you're talking about approximately $600 million less in sales revenue. And then when you add both of those to the mix, you've got 9% and 3% revenue increase for every 1% increase that you have in any one of those two. Everybody still with me? So this makes good business sense, right? So this isn't a burden conversation. This is a business conversation. And that's how the conversation of diversity needs to change. It needs to present itself less as an obligation and more as a growth mechanism and a growth technique for a company. So, when we look out again at diversity and productivity, we see that you get 39% higher customer service, 22% higher productivity rates, and 22% lower turnover rates when you have diverse teams. Anybody in HR knows that all of these things are integral to the fabric of a company. If you cannot keep your employees, if you cannot make within sales, if you cannot make your clients happy, clients or customers happy, if you cannot maintain a bar of productivity, you're going to have a serious business issue. And this is all from Gallup. So what are the broader reasons to build a diversity agenda? The talent pipeline, supplier development and growth, market penetration, which I feel like is one of the things that's often under-discussed. Market penetration is very important. And then diversified brand visibility and awareness. Again, that goes back to market penetration and sales. Is anybody in here in sales? Some hands should be raised. Everybody's in the business of selling something. If it's nothing more than yourself. So, why would you want to use diversity as a tool for sustainability? We'll give a case study, and some of you may already know about this. So, when Chevy had a car, they had a car called the Chevy Nova. Anybody remember the Chevy Nova? Oh, now we have hands. The Chevy Nova, okay? So this was the car. This was the car. It was one of, everybody knows it. So they decided that they wanted to enter into the South American market, particularly Mexico. They didn't consult. They didn't have a lot of diversity on the sales team. They didn't have a lot of diversity on the product team. And they said, we're going to go to Mexico with this car. Now, who speaks Spanish in this room? All right. So then you know that the Nova means Nova, no go. So if you have a car called Nova, no go, that seems kind of counterproductive to the brand that you're trying to create for the car that you're trying to sell. So it goes without saying that they had dismal sales of the Nova. In fact, the Nova. So that, to me, is one of those examples where if you had but one person on the team who could have consulted you and told you that that was not a good idea, that could have saved the company millions and possibly billions of dollars in production, in sales, in marketing for something that was not going to go anywhere in the first place. And that happens more often than not. The other place that diversity comes into play is diversity of thought. Now, I'm originally from Rochester, New York, and Rochester is very well known for Kodak. Anybody know about Kodak? Okay. Kodak, Xerox, and Bosch & Lomb. Those were household staples. If you wanted to make a copy, it was a Xerox. Remember that? If you wanted to take a picture, it was a Kodak moment. Well, not anymore. And what you saw happening in the late 90s, mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s, was the dissipation of Kodak and the infusion of a new company, which was Fuji. Anybody remember Fuji? And instead of the yellow and black box that looked like a little bumblebee, which I remember as a kid, you started to see the green and black box, which is Fuji. So Fuji now started to encroach, and this is obviously a company, an international company, on Kodak's domestic market share, to the point now where we all know the unfortunate story of Kodak. Kodak is now selling and liquidating its intellectual property, while Instagram, with its 12 employees, is being sold to Facebook for the billions. Okay, so Kodak had 60,000 some odd employees, and Instagram was sold in the billions with its 12 or so odd employees. So times are a-changing, and it's important to understand how these changes are happening against the context of diversity in the entire spectrum of what that means. So what does that mean to you? Experts say that successful companies and individuals will move the organization to one that understands and is effective in the multicultural world. That multiculturalism just becomes a part of, as I've already said, the fabric of how you do business, because it's important. How is it also important? Because of the social capital quotient. So, you have human capital. Human capital without social capital. Social capital is the ability for you to have someone do something for you, do something with you, give you some type of benefit or gain, whether economically or not. All as a result of a relationship that you have. And particularly when it comes to diverse communities, there's a dearth of what I call cross-cultural social capital. What that means to me is that you have, folks, African Americans that only know African Americans, Hispanics that only know Hispanics, that have social capital only in their communities. But if we're not able to transcend the racial and ethnic social capital structure, to be able to have African Americans and Hispanics and whites and Asians all having relationships with each other that lead to some form of social benefit, that lead to some form of capital, that leads to, in turn, social capital, we're still going to have a problem on our hands within the companies that we work with. And that turns itself into, when you have those things, knowledge capital. It turns itself into the very innovation that we're talking about is necessary to drive any body and any business forward in 2015 and beyond. So Harvard Business School says, how to build relationships. Because that's part of what we're here talking about today. We've just heard about biases. We've heard about how to take your career to the next level. But how do you authentically and genuinely build relationships that actually have the ability to turn into social capital structures for you? Well, what they found is, within the context of work, for people to move ahead and build real business relationships, they had to have these 5 things. 1, the person just actually has to like you. So for some of us, that's just going to be a challenge. They just actually have to like you. Now, all jokes aside, and to really be clear about this number one, actually can be very difficult for people of color sometimes. And for all people. But since we're at a diversity luncheon, I'll speak specifically to the people of color agenda. How do you get yourself into a situation where you're liked? Then how do you move from like to professional respect? So I can like you. Oh, Bobby's cool to hang out with. He's funny. But I would never give him something serious to do. Anybody know anybody like that? He's a hoot. You can waste some time with him at work, but don't give him anything serious because he won't get it done. This is how you build social capital. Social capital, i.e. business relationships. Then you have to have an admiration for the whole person. So that's more prolific to me than just the basics of I have to like you. You have to have some level of interest in the entire context of who that person is. Because then what happens? Then what happens is an intertwining of work and professional life. How many of you all have ever been in a situation where you didn't get invited to that golf game? You didn't get invited to that dinner at the house. You found out that folks went and got a beer after work one day and you were just devastated. That in and of itself right there is the intertwining of work and personal and professional. You're being invited now to someone's home. This is how you build social capital. And I say all this because this is about building relationships here. It's about diversity, advancing your career. These are the steps that you need to take. Relationships, finally, then, exist despite the business affiliation. Has anybody ever had an experience where the moment they changed jobs, folks stopped picking up the phone? The moment you weren't cutting checks, folks stopped picking up the phone. So if you don't really have a relationship with someone that transcends the context of work, then you don't really have social capital. Because what that means is that you're constantly and always having to barter and trade something very specific with someone. But social capital comes on the context of relationships. So how does this play itself out when it comes to diversity and how people build relationships? These are the things that stand in the way. Language. I mean, that's the most fundamental and very obvious. Values and etiquette. Tone. In some communities, in some cultures, I mean, you could literally feel like someone was hollering at you. And we all have a cousin, an aunt, an uncle that, did you just verbally assault me? When you told me you loved me, I wasn't clear, Uncle Joe. And then the last one is clustering. And clustering is, there's a book that's called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Lunchroom? And basically what it's getting to is the idea that regardless of whether someone has told you no or not, there's a clustering of things, of people based off, presumed commonalities, which oftentimes come down to things like race or ethnicity. And so these are the things that make it difficult for people of color to build social capital across cultural lines. And the ownership and responsibility for these fall with everybody. Because a lot of times, and I'll talk about this later, it's easy to say, well, they just didn't accept me. But sometimes I ask, did you put yourself in a position to even be asked? And that becomes a new question. So, how do you get over these things? The first thing you need to do is ask. I can't tell you how many conversations I have in all the facets of work that I do, where people come to me and they say, I know this might sound absolutely ridiculous, but I just want to ask you a question. You have to give people safe places to be able to ask things that they may feel uncomfortable asking you, without the feeling that they're going to get beat up or beat down after they say it. Because that happens. And you just have to understand that sometimes people just don't know, even when you think they ought to. If you have kids in this room, which I don't, then you already know what I'm talking about. And so I think it's important for us to create, as we build diversity agendas, safe spaces for people to really, truly ask and get answers to the questions that they have, or to talk about something in such a manner, maybe they're not asking, but to talk about something where it's almost like a flush through session with you. I've had these kind of conversations with people, from everywhere, from at my office to on the plane. And when you can walk away from a conversation about race that could have gone any way, it could have gone any which way, somebody could have gotten kicked off the plane, with folks giving each other a hug at the end of the plane ride, I think we're making ground. And that takes two parties. And that's part of my point with this. It falls, I call it inclusive diversity. It falls on both sides of the spectrum, the responsibility. The next thing is find some form of commonality. So, on surface blush, you could have nothing in common with, I could have nothing in common with all of you. You could have nothing in common with the person sitting next to you if you don't know them. Once you start talking about things outside of the context of work, how many people introduce themselves this way? Hi, my name is so-and-so. Okay, I do so-and-so. That's a showstopper in some instances right there. You're already leading off with what you do professionally, not who you are as a person. In fact, I actually learned this change for myself in the great state of Texas, second only to, because I want you all to like me, the great state of South Carolina. When I led off only with what I did, whatever it was either a conversation starter or stopper for two different reasons. Either it was starting because you wanted something, or it was ending because you didn't feel connected to it. Anybody been there before? It's kind of like, oh, well, I do so-and-so and they do so-and-so. We have nothing in common. Well, you don't know that. You haven't even had a chance to have a real conversation. And so I think it's important for people to find something in common with each other. We have a lot more in common than we think we do. In fact, just sitting at this table, I was talking to Pastor Deb, right? And maybe we didn't have anything in common, but we do. I'm headed to Tokyo, and she has family that's actually been in Asia. That's a conversation starter. We feel like we have something in common there. We had something to talk about. How many missed opportunities do you have, or have you had, where you didn't start off a conversation more with the value of who you are as a person, as a being, and less with the value of who you are as a professional. We'll get to that because everybody knows you do business with people you have personal relationships with. Business is a relationship business. So when I ask you who's in sales, everybody is in sales. There we go, sir. That's right. But with that commonality, there's also a responsibility for you to be authentic. It doesn't mean that you don't hold true to who you are. It doesn't mean that you decide that you're going to be this person for that person and this person for that person. It doesn't mean that you pale away from the light that you provide to the universe. What it means is that you walk into it, and you walk into it very confidently. And people will come to terms with a level of respect for you because you respect yourself. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say this? There's a way to be humbly assertive and humbly confident. There are a lot of people who are very confident, but they're not humble. And there are people that you don't end up talking to very long. And then there are a lot of people who are overly humble, too passive, too shy to even say what they do, to even finish their last name. You know, I'm just happy to be here. No, you belong here. You are here. You are right where you are supposed to be. So be here and be here confidently. And so I think when we talk about who we are, and when we talk about being diverse communities, and when we talk about people of color, when we talk about gender, we talk about age, we talk about whatever it is, because diversity is every single thing in this room. It's important that you're authentic to yourselves. And what I have actually found is that people then become interested in the uniqueness of you, because you are so confident about your authenticity that they actually want to know more about it. Because sometimes it's a surprise to folks. And then sometimes it's an inspiration to them. Either way, they're interested. And the last one is proactively engage. Now, I've been joking about us all being in the business of sales. But if we're grown adults, you have to be comfortable with hearing no. You have to be comfortable with someone dismissing you. You have to be comfortable with this as a concept. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and still be comfortable. And the reason why is because the only way that you're going to get invited to that beer after work, sometimes for some folks in some places, in some spaces of their life, but the only way you're going to get invited to that girlfriend's brunch, sometimes in some places, in some spaces of folks' life, is if you go out and ask them. You go and you tell them, I'd like to come. Yeah. Oh. I happened to overhear, Bob, that you all caught a brew last week. Sure would love to join you next time you go. So what can they do? Two things. Tell you yes or tell you no. Either way, you're still alive. What has changed? Nothing. And in fact, in some instances, what you might realize is that sometimes people may themselves feel uncomfortable telling you no. So you might have an invitation just because they couldn't tell you no. And then because we're in the business of ABC, always be closing, first sale is you, you have the opportunity to make or break that as a personal relationship opportunity. If you show up to get bruised and you're over in the corner, I'm just happy to be here, then you're not really going to make an authentic relationship because you're not being authentic to yourself. But if you show up and you get engaged and you get involved, and you find commonalities, oh, we've got a starter there. we've got a real starter there. I had a young woman, and I'll be quick here. I had a young woman who told me when I spoke at Johns Hopkins maybe 3 weeks ago. She said, my boss, he doesn't even look at me when I talk to him. I said, okay, tell me more. When I'm in the meetings, it's me and this, another associate. We're the same age. We do the same thing. And he looks at him more than he looks at me. I said, okay, so tell me more. How are these meetings happening? She's like, well, we both go in and da-da-da. I said, so when was the last time that you went alone? Well, I don't really feel. I said, so you are also complaining about the crutch that you use. You use your other coworker as a crutch to feel comfortable to walk into your boss's office, but then when you get in there and the eye contact isn't on you, anybody feeling where I'm going with this? So I said, I think what you need to do is go meet with him on your own. And he needs to see you as an individual person, not an associated part of him. But that's your responsibility to be proactive. And if he says we can't get lunch till next year, 2017, you say, okay. You then go back and say, did your schedule free up? And try to get lunch again. When I network, sometimes I actually assert myself in the middle of a conversation. I've been known to do this. It may happen to some of y'all in here later on today. I challenge myself. I live in Austin, and I work in a very heavily dominated technology city that's oftentimes dominated by millennial white males, to be very honest with you. And I could either shy away from that, or I could walk right up into the event and shake your hand and start talking to you. And that's the way I would rather do it. Because there's no point in me showing up to a networking event if I'm going to be over in the corner complaining about the fact that I can't network. It's actually my job to be proactive. And if I hear a few no's, but I realize that people don't want to be uncomfortable and tell you goodbye. So they'll just sit there and listen to you until you leave. And that's okay, because I got my sale done. So overall, in my conclusion, diversity presents strategic and long-term return on investment potential for people and businesses. Because businesses are nothing more than a collection of people. Diversity is a growth opportunity for you, again, personally and professionally. And then the last thing I'll say is this: domestic diversity pipeline to local and global markets. Diversified staff can provide a gateway to and insight on domestic and global markets. You can leverage your diverse talent for internal focus groups and market research to understand cultural distinctions and variances. And then diversified procurement pipeline increases economic growth, disposable income in communities, and customer loyalty. And if people are making it, they have a higher propensity to buy it. So it's in your best interest across the board to get on the diversity train. Thank you so much.
So I'll share a story that may make Jill blush, but so I have known Jill Littlejohn for a very long time. I've lived in Greenville for 8 years, a little over 8 years. And when I first moved here, I went to a dinner. I can't even remember. It was one of those rubber chicken dinners. And I just saw this like energy ball kind of flowing throughout the room. And it was Jill. And at the time, she was an accountant. She wasn't in nonprofit leadership at the time. And she just had this electric sensibility about her. And I was like, I got to know this girl. I just moved to Greenville. I had 0 friends. I was feeling really sorry for myself as far as my friendship network. And I just walked right up to her, kind of taking Natalie's advice, inserted myself into Jill's world, and said that she had to go to lunch with me. And I as you were talking about, people not wanting to say no, I kind of feel like that's how Jill felt. That she really wanted to say no, but she just said yes. And so but that was just this wonderful connection, and I've done that so many times, and even in my organization, I work at Greenville Health System. Still, when new leaders start, I make it a point to take them to coffee, to take them to lunch, and just to see what their backgrounds are, what their world is, what their passions are, tell them my story. And once you have that foundation of a relationship, you can do so many things together. You can also challenge each other. You can disagree more eloquently when you know someone and you know their story well. So I would say, insert yourself into people's worlds, kind of building on Natalie's advice, and invite them to lunch. You might have to cough up some cash for a coffee here and there, but it's worth it, because when I look at this electric ball of energy that is Jill Littlejohn, and how her career has grown, and the force that she is in our community, and what a dear friend she is to me, what if I'd not had the bravery back then to ask her to go to lunch?
Natalie?
I think you've covered it. I think it's just that. It's about being proactive and really engaging folks despite any fears that you may have to do so. So that's my answer. Yeah.
Good. I think we have a question over here on the left.
Is this on? Yes. Hi, my name is Jennifer Gutierrez, and I have a question for both Natalie and Keneal. Natalie, it was a fantastic speech, so thank you for joining us today. My question would be if y'all both could elaborate more on being humbly assertive and tactful in the workplace. I understand this, picking and choosing your battles, but when you hear discriminatory comments or microaggressions in the workforce, and it's a fine line, I think, between maintaining that professional relationship, but also addressing folks in a assertive way to, don't speak to me like that, or never say that comment again. So can you elaborate more on again, being humbly assertive and more tactful?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I actually had to have a conversation with someone who I very highly respect, sit on the board with, and they made a few comments that affected me. I didn't like what they said, and they were racially based comments. And I had to say, okay, what was this person's intention? Because I think it's also very easy for us to just jump at something. Did I truly feel like that person had malicious intentions with what they said, or were they just bad comedians? And I came to terms with the fact that I felt like he was just not good with his comedy. So then that also informed how I then was going to address this issue with him. So I called him and I said, listen, I respect you, I love you, da-da-da-da, but I want to tell you that these two things that you said made me feel uncomfortable. And because I respect you, I want to tell you and you only. And the person said to me, I really appreciate you telling me that, because they didn't even know that what they said made me feel like that. And now I could have then turned around and done microaggression or passivity, and then become recluse around that person. Oh, hi, and then kept it moving. And the dynamic and structure of our relationship could have changed, which is what happens a lot of times when people don't want to address and have truly difficult conversations with people. Or I could have done what I did, which is have a private conversation with him, tell him I respect him, because I do, and then tell him what I felt like had happened and how it made me feel. And I feel like the human element in most people, when addressed like that, is to be more understanding. In a work situation, I would just choose to ask your boss or your coworker to go out of the office. Because when you're in the office, you're still in an office context. And office dynamics are still at play. But once you go outside of the office, the reality is that you are two human beings. Two human beings put here on the same earth. And you have a situation. Be calm, keep a level head, don't make it overly emotional, and don't put too much intention behind their comment. Even if it was in spite. It's for you to say, I'm not going to digest it like that, but I'm going to tell you how I feel. And I think that that's how you can handle that in the office place.
Thank you.
I can go to the next question.
Okay. Well, I was just going to add, and I totally agree with Natalie, and I think we talked about in my breakout session, implicit bias, and I'm in the business of investigating situations where people feel like discrimination has occurred. And what I share with my session attendees is that I've never, ever sat across the table from anybody in any of those investigations where they said, oh yeah, I'm a big old racist. That's never happened. If it does, I swear lightning will strike in my office. But the reality is that these investigations come across my desk on a semi-regular basis. And so I like Natalie's advice around, you know, really affirming the relationship and the value of the relationship. And I also like the advice of having a private conversation. I've observed situations where people have redirected a comment in a public forum and tried to humiliate the person. And that has some really corrosive effects long term. And I've been that person that's publicly humiliated another person. And I don't think that that served me or that other person well in the long run. So I think a private conversation, and usually what I would say is, you know, I heard you make the comment XYZ. Can you talk to me about what your intentions were there? Because what I found is usually there's a big disconnect between people's intentions and their impact. And so when you learn what their intentions are, then you can say, gosh, I feel like maybe there was some distance there between the intention that you had and the impact. And having that conversation behind closed doors, I love that advice from Natalie.
Next question.
Thank you guys both for coming here, being in Greenville, and doing this. One of my questions primarily, not necessarily directed to leadership. I think there's a lot of leaders in the room, and we're all leaders in our respective lives. But more so from, we've talked about, or we probably hear a lot about leading up. I'd like to hear your thoughts on leading diversity up. As a person that is a cog in a wheel and part of my life, as an African-American male, I think a lot about, well, what happens if I wasn't here? Would the next person look like me? Would the next person get a shot who looked like me? So can you guys talk a little bit about how you would think about leading diversity when you're not the person at the top of the company, and how you can, you know, kind of facilitate that as well?
Great question.
I'll just start out by saying, so there's some interest, I'm a research junkie, there's some interesting research about how people behave in situations where they are a token, whatever that is, the only woman, the only person of color, the only man. We see that in nursing units a lot, in healthcare systems. I actually wrote my dissertation on tokenism and what that looks like. And so there was one study that looked at how lower ranking women behave at an accounting firm where there are one or two women at the top of the accounting firm, and then how lower ranking women behave at an accounting firm where there's a critical mass of women at the top. And what the study found was that women at the sort of token leadership firm saw their peers as competition and sort of adversarial dynamics. Women that worked at firms where there was a critical mass of women at the top actually saw their female peers at their level as more colleagues, supportive, people that they could trust. And so when I read these kinds of studies, I think, well, gosh, you know, how do I behave if I perceive, am I helping women and people of color at my level? And so I think one piece of advice in terms of leading up is to actually be that person that supports other people of color in your organization, and be that person that supports by having those conversations with more senior leadership. You know, you don't want that to be your whole identity as a professional, but I think somebody who's affirming. I've observed sometimes that people of color in senior leadership roles are very reticent to actually advocate for diversity because they don't want to be seen as the one African American who's also carrying the diversity flag. And I think that that's a shame. I think that's a shame, because I think that there's a beautiful opportunity when you're at the senior leadership table to really carry that conversation in a way that people can hear it.
I absolutely agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why one of my slides was about being authentic, because I feel like that's a bit disingenuous. when people do that at the office. And I understand the context under which it happens, but I think it's unfair to generations that come after that person. A couple of things, and I love your comments about being a token. I think there's also a corrective way in that people can be corrected in language, or even influenced in something as subtle as the language that you use. So, for example, and this is about leading up, let's just say someone says, I didn't catch your name, but, John, what is it?
Harold.
I'm Harold. Sorry, I should have
Hi,
introduced
Harold.
myself.
They're like, oh, Harold, you really just are such a great example of black men. I wish more, it's almost as though you are the only example that people have. Now, you have the opportunity to take that and let that inflate up your ego and roll with that, and then, later on you don't want to help anyone. Or what you can do is say, I have a couple of buddies or other friends that I'd love to potentially introduce you to, or maybe we could host something at the office and bring some other good talent to the office, or I have other friends that do X and Y, just something that changes the language a bit so that it's not just about you being the exception to the rule. Because the reality is, people give me compliments a lot, and that's God's favor, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, I don't want to be the only black woman that you feel that way about. I feel like I'm not doing my part if you walk away giving me all the credit and you can see that the light is shining on lots of other people around me. And I think that there's a language way, a subtle way that you can start the process of changing people's perceptions of how dynamic communities of color are, and that there's no one monolith. It's not like that. And I remember talking to someone when I was 22, and they said, well, where do you want to be by the time you're 30? And I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I'm going to be on the cover of Black Enterprise. And sure enough, that's how it happened. So, for me, I've always kind of tried to plan things, but the reality of the fact is, some of the most amazing experiences I've had with my life have been where that planning met a very high degree of spontaneity. It was like I was not planning to be doing X, Y, and Z, but because I was planning and I was preparing, it prepared me for X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z wasn't on my list. You see what I'm saying? And so the way that life has the ability to flow is very fluidly, and I think it's important to be open to that and open to the possibilities that you could have with your career. Even me moving to Austin. I was from New York. I was like, no, I'm not going to Texas. And then God had it on my heart. I moved to Texas, and it's been one of the most amazing career decisions I've ever made in my life. But I never saw myself living in Texas. But everything I did before then was in preparation for the big task I had on my hand to turn this chamber around. And that's what we've done. So have goals. Don't have too many plans, because then you get stuck. And be flexible with yourself and with life.
I feel like I want to go to lunch with Natalie now. And like, how can I get on the cover of Black Enterprise?
Stick with me, girl. We'll do it together again.
So actually, I've had a lot of spontaneity in some of, like, every time I go back to school, I've been in a school my whole adult life, and it's not really that fun, actually. But I haven't really thought a lot about it. Each time I'm like, well, I probably should get a master's, so let me just sign up. And I probably should go back to school and get my doctorate, so let me sign up. And so I have had a lot of spontaneity. I hadn't thought about it till I heard Natalie talking. I think the only other piece of advice that I would add is get clear on the activities that you actually like to do, which is different than what your job might be. So for the longest time, I thought I wanted to be an attorney, because I watched them on TV and they just seemed really like a sassy bunch that I would want, I wanted to go and step up to the judge and have those secret conversations, But what I realized is that's not actually what most lawyers do all day. I would rather cut off the top digit of my finger than to read a contract in its entirety And that's what a lot of them do all day. And no disrespect to my lawyer friends in the room who enjoy doing that work, but that is not something that I would actually enjoy doing. And so I had a mentor tell me years ago, get a little note card like a 3x5, and I've given this advice to some people in this room probably. What are the actual daily activities that you want to do? Do you want to be going to meetings? Do you want to be sitting in an office? Do you want to be out in the field? Do you want to be working on different tasks? Do you want to be working on the same tasks? Do you want to be working behind the scenes, or do you want to be in the grassroots, right in front of the people that you're serving? Whatever that is, get clear on that. And then once you've got some clarity there, the jobs will kind of follow that. But you need to know, because if you follow the job, then that may be in service to your ego, which doesn't always serve us well career-wise. You want to actually be happy. And it's a lot better to be happy making $50,000 a year than to be miserable making $500.
Awesome. So this will be our last question over on the left. So I know all of you had questions now that we got started, but I know that Natalie is on social media and Keneal kinda, so we can get questions later.
I have a Facebook
over here
page.
to the left.
Thank you, Jill, for taking mine as the last question. Good afternoon, Ms. Caulfield and Dr. Coltman. My name is Allison Brown, and I'm really interested in, for you both, at what point was the new definition of diversity realized? I work with college-age students, so student development is very interesting to me. So if you could think back, was it in your personal upbringing or an educational setting where you had that aha moment, diversity is important?
Diversity is important?
Yes.
I mean, for me, it's always been important. That's something that we encouraged in my upbringing. My parents raised us to have a sense of community, and a sense of community that was broader than just our community, but inclusive of it and engaged in it at its core. I went to Howard University, and I grew up in an all-white community when I was younger, and we were the only 3 black kids in my neighborhood, and that went to our school for a while. And I remember going to Howard, and I broke down in tears my freshman year, because I looked to my left and I looked to my right, and we were at a football game, and there was the most black people I'd ever seen in my entire life. And the crazy thing is that people would assume that that's not the case, but it was the case. And I was just like, wow, all these black people in this room, oh my goodness, and they're all in school, like, whoa, I only saw this on The Cosby Show, Hillman, a different world. And it just made me cry, because I was so proud. I was so proud to be a part of that. And I was also shedding this preconceived idea that even I had of who I was and who black people in this country were for me, because I was having to confront the fact that everybody was not the same. And that was an interesting experience for me to have. And I think, Howard really helped to shape and mold me into the woman that I am today. Any bison in the room? Oh, there we go. Woo-woo.
Keneal.
So I too grew up in an all-white neighborhood. I know that's shocking. And in all seriousness, I was exposed to just no diversity in any way that you could possibly define it, really until I went to high school. We all didn't really have a lot of money. We were poor kids living in a farm community. We're all white, Southern Baptists. I mean, I was so sheltered during that time. In my little Southern Baptist church, we studied Jewish people. I thought this was an ancient people that had died off during biblical times. I just truly had no exposure as a child. I went to high school as in the neighboring town, and there was a handful of black kids in an otherwise all-white high school, and I witnessed a lot of racism. And I was so ill at ease and unsure what to do about it, and I just felt, and you experience it differently when you're white, right? I mean, you can be silent, you can be complicit with it, and I probably was when I was in high school because I just didn't have the maturity to know what to do about it. And then in college, I really made the decision that I wanted to work on racism, like that I think that for my white colleagues in the room, we have a special responsibility to work on this work too. And for me, it's deeply personal. It's what I feel like I was put on this earth to do. But I think white folks are really important in helping us to challenge a racist system that we all participate in our own respective ways. Black folks, white folks, Hispanics, Asians, we all participate in systems of racism in different ways. And so I think for me, that was kind of the introduction to my journey, but it's evolved to more of an issue of just general social justice, and that anytime I'm in a position to work within a system to improve that system so that more people can be included at the table, then that's the kind of work that I get really excited about. And I still have my own stuff that I want to work on in myself, but for me, that was my journey, is probably the opposite of having a diverse experience growing up.
Let's give these ladies a round of applause.